It's October 9th, 2016, and you're listening to All Things Carried on NPR.
This is NPR.
Shout out the radio station, they gave you what you wanted.
Anthem of Public Radio.
Now I gotta give a shout out to Seagram Gin, because I drink it and they paying me for it.
Support for NPR comes from
Seagram Gin.
This is National Public Radio.
Today we'll be discussing the book The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien and his methods of characterization. Joining me are McKinnon Sowell and Garrison Wheeler, who will also be sharing their input on the matter.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Let's get started, shall we? Today we're going to be looking at the chapter The Sweetheart of the Song Bong. Now let's begin with the main character and star of the chapter, Marianne. An incredibly interesting character. McKinnon, let's have you start us off. How is Marianne generally characterized over the course of the chapter?
Firstly, I would say that the characterization of Marianne is not concrete, in the sense that she acts almost as a wild card. By this I mean that when her friend from elementary school who's serving in Vietnam asks her to travel out of the country to help out at a camp based in the Chule Mountains of Vietnam, and she willingly comes, shows that she is clearly fearless, or at least eager to help out. However, we as readers are given a different sweetheart characterization of her when focusing on the outfit she arrives in, a pink sweater and typical sweetheart clothes. The two contrasting characterizations were first given to Marianne, to us as readers, that she is your typical feminine woman, but is willing to seek out adventure.
Almost a walking paradox, so to speak.
I agree. Marianne is shown to be sort of self-contradictory entity at the beginning of the chapter, and I think that generates foreshadowing for the events to take place later in the story, by firstly letting the reader know that while her appearance shows she to be a stable, average feminine woman, we cannot be sure of the decisions she will make later on in the story. And with the culture and events that were occurring at this time in Vietnam, Marianne's unpredictable personality may be more likely to make drastic, surprising decisions.
So, you would say that the atmosphere of Vietnam might bring out Marianne's unstable side more than it was before?
In a sense, yes.
It's almost as if it's not the war necessarily that changes Marianne, but instead it's the culture and atmosphere of Vietnam, mixed with Marianne's chancy personality.
I agree. Taking a look at page 98, it's obvious that it has an almost immediate effect on her when she begins to help out the medics as casualties come pouring in. Rat Kiley says, in times of action, her face took on a sudden new composure, almost serene, the fuzzy blue eyes narrowing into a tight, intelligent focus. Mark Fosse would grin at this. He was proud, yes, but also amazed. A different person, it seemed, and he wasn't sure what to make of it. Though we never really got to see what Marianne was like before she came over to Vietnam, Mark's reaction makes it apparent that this is not the girl she once was.
Wonderful. Coming back after the break, Garrison will lead us into the discussion of the elements of the Chulai Mountains and the Vietnam culture that led to Marianne's psychological change. And now, while we take our break, this is a track by Clara Bellar entitled Ciel de Paris.
Sous le ciel de Paris s'envole une chanson.
NPR, this is Jonah Bird here with McKinnon Sowell and Garrison Wheeler discussing the novel The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien and his use of characterization in the novel.
I'd like to take a look on pages 88 and 89, where O'Brien discusses the Green Berets and the arrival of Marianne. Firstly, he describes the Green Berets, saying, the Greenies were not social animals. Animals, Rat said, but far from social. O'Brien then moves on to describe Marianne upon her arrival, saying, at best, Rat said, she was 17 years old, fresh out of Cleveland Heights Senior High. She had long white legs and blue eyes and a complexion like strawberry ice cream. Very friendly, too. At this point in the story, we as readers immediately see the juxtaposition of the Green Berets and Marianne. We see Marianne as very friendly and sociable, while the Green Berets are described as antisocial and barbaric.
And we see the war slowly taking over the normality of this 17-year-old girl as she begins to gain a deep interest in the environment, even becoming part of it. As the chapter progresses, the reader is able to see that the war is slowly corrupting Marianne. It is quite possible that O'Brien wrote this chapter to show the reader that the power the war had on these innocent kids. By the end of the chapter, Marianne has become a completely different character than what she was upon her arrival.
Marianne serves as a dynamic character, constantly changing and evolving towards her environment and interests with the war. And the great thing about this is that the characterization of Marianne changes dramatically depending on the critical lens you look at her through. Garrison, a quick explanation of critical lenses for us?
Of course, of course. Allow me to explain, my good sir. The literary critical lens you read through really sort of determines how you intercept the text, what it means, and what it's concerned with. There are around 8 primary critical lenses, and those are biographical, historical, psychological, archetypal, feminist, objective, Marxist, and a genre. Now, you could try to apply each and every lens to a piece of literature and find some way to make it work, but obviously, some are going to be more relevant than others, like The Hobbit, for example, a great classic. The novel, however, has no female characters whatsoever, so it's likely that reading it through a feminist lens won't yield much meaning.
Wonderful, thank you. Now, there are 2 critical lenses that I think would work best for this chapter, and those are psychological and the one you mentioned, feminist. Now, the psychological one is pretty obvious, right? We've been talking about how the war has changed her personality and her mind, but there's more to it. What I think makes this chapter so affecting is that the change of her character is so sudden and out of nowhere. Of course, we can say all that about how war changes people, it sticks with you, all that. That seems a little too easy, yeah? Her change seems almost to be a complicit or a willing one. You think of the soldiers out fighting wars, and I'm pretty sure if you ask them, they'd say that they don't want the war to have a psychological effect on them. But Marianne actively seeks it out.
Yeah, that's a good point. When you look at the action of the chapter, not once is Marianne caught in actual combat the way the soldiers are. As far as we know, anyway. No bombings, grenades, gunfights, nothing. So why is she affected? You're saying she wanted it to change her?
Right, so the question becomes, why did she want it to change her? What were her motivations? Obviously, she didn't come to Vietnam with the intention of being psychologically affected, so what was it she found there that made the change from what she was before?
And what exactly was she before?
Well, she was just a regular girl, right? This is 1960s America. People are still riding off the high of the golden age that was the 1950s. Looking at page 90, she arrives at that sort of fairy tale of the American dream. Rat says, from the 6th grade on, they had known for a fact that someday they would be married and live in a fine gingerbread house near Lake Erie and have 3 healthy yellow-haired children and grow old together, and no doubt die in each other's arms and be buried in the same walnut casket. That was the plan. So obviously this is a bit of an exaggeration, a cynical hyperbole, if you will. But it's not far off from how people actually thought, right? I'd go so far as to say Marianne's vision of happiness has been molded by society, a vision which she's conforming to.
Exactly. Marianne has lived the vast majority of her life conforming to society's accepted definition of success and happiness. So when she comes to Vietnam, she's attracted to that huge disconnect between their way of life and ours. It's not a juxtaposition that the novel makes very clear, but if you look at how she reacts to the village near the compound in particular, it's clear that she sees a difference, and she likes it. She talks about how quaint and simple it is. That, along with what we talked about earlier, how she was enraptured by the action of the medical work, shows that Vietnam agrees with her, even more so than America did. It's a chance to break free of those societal norms that she's been adhering to all her life. It empowers her, whereas she was just being a person she was told to be. At the end, she can sense this herself. On page 106, she says, I feel close to myself. I'm burning away into nothing, but it doesn't matter because I know exactly who I am. You can't feel like that anywhere else.
Certainly not in America, right?
So in Vietnam, she becomes herself, right? So my question now is, why her? What makes her special?
This is the most interesting part, I think. From the very beginning, there's a great juxtaposition between her and the soldiers. She shows up wearing a pink sweater, white culottes, and makeup. Meanwhile, these guys are wearing fatigues and haven't showered in God knows how long. She goes from one extreme to the other, from prissy and innocent to more experienced and hardened than the soldiers could ever hope to be. But the biggest thing is how she reacts to the war's effect. She embraces it, she lets it take hold and become herself. The soldiers, meanwhile, are afraid but they can't show it. O'Brien talks about how they carry themselves with dignity and form. When they get tossed into combat, the soldiers break down. Afterwards, they have to pull themselves together, pretend to be unfazed and brave, conform to their expectations for each other, while Marianne is actively shedding that burden.
It's a lot like Norman Bowker and Kiowa. Kiowa talked to relieve himself of his burdens, but Norman Bowker couldn't. He had to keep it bottled up to his own detriment. Alright, now let's move on to the feminist lens.
Just a quick interjection. Let's try to keep this short and sweet, shall we? If I'm not mistaken, our audience has about 100 more of these things to grade.
Do you mind if I take head on this one?
Oh yes, by all means, take head.
Thank you. Now, I'll start by saying we did come pretty close several times in the past several minutes to using the feminist lens, especially with all that about shedding societal norms. But let's take a closer look at the relationship between Marianne and her boyfriend, Mark Fosse. The beginning of the chapter, I'd say Marianne pretty clearly fits the gender stereotype, the young, innocent girl appearing as a cute blonde, acting as a fun-loving, flirtatious love interest for Mark Fosse. But her challenge and transformation out of this stereotype is itself the subject of the chapter, wouldn't you say? She begins this as this one-dimensional subservient element. She doesn't even arrive in Vietnam on her own. It's Mark Fosse enacting this on her. But as the chapter progresses, she is characterized with this growing complexity, a walking paradox like we said earlier, that wears both a nice pink sweater and a necklace of human tongues. The relationship between man and woman in this chapter begins with Mark Fosse being the dominant factor, as he was the primary impetus for her presence. Additionally, he makes several attempts to dictate her actions throughout the chapter. By the end, however, Mark is begging Marianne to return to her former self. Ostensibly, she now has the power over him, or at the very least is no longer subject to his own decisions. The chapter challenges the idea that women are one-dimensional static characters whose purpose is to bring comfort to men. Fosse brings Marianne pretty much for his own comfort and neglects to consider how the war might affect her.
Wonderful, and it looks like that's about all we have time for. Thank you, McKinnon and Garrison. It was great having you on the show.
Thank you for having us.
My pleasure.
This has been All Things Carried on NPR. Thank you for listening.
Page.
This is NPR.
Shout out the radio station that gave you what you wanted.
Anthem of Public Radio.
Now I gotta give a shout out to Seagram Gin, cause I drink it and they pay me for it.
Support for NPR comes from
Seagram Gin.
This is National Public Radio.